And those relationships tend to be ongoing. And that's probably the biggest distinction for me, is that those relationships are something that we're engaged in building and having a back and forth with, ongoing.
I would add to that, from a stakeholder definition standpoint, is a group that would have a very important role in determining or influencing the outcome of an organization's business or strategic plan. So they have a very specific role. It's not just only a voice.
So again, building on what Helen was saying, those stakeholders generally will have a significant influence on how we do our work, whether that be helping us deliver or otherwise. The broader community the people going to have an interest in what we do, but perhaps not such a direct influence on the outcomes. Yeah. It's that influence, I think, is the key word for me.
Influence is a big word. From my experience, stakeholders tend to be organized groups. As you said, it could be part of institutions, but they tend to be organized groups. In communities, sometimes those groups are very informal. They may just be kind of gathering for only a particular purpose, and they may only play a very limited, role, but they don't have a formalized way. But those voices are important too.
When we are chatting with people, we want to be as inclusive and welcoming to all voices that we can, knowing that when we come back and we're sitting with that input, how some voices are going to have more impact than others. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it's a fairly dynamic process as well. No community will be the same in terms of who the groups are and who the communities are. So one school district may be very different than the neighboring school district. But from our practice standpoint, it is very important at the beginning to be really clear in how and who you define as those groups, and have a very disciplined process to think about identifying what those groups are, who they are, and then follow through in terms of different ways that they will be engaged throughout the process. You have to think first in terms of why. What is the objective of the consultation? What do you hope to achieve? What kind of outcomes and information do you need? And that forms, the core or the focus then of that consultation. And that why, in terms of, the purpose of the consultation, needs to link back to that strategic analysis about, what are some of the issues that we want to hear from? So for us, the word is purposeful engagement or purposeful consultation.
And what do we want from this? And what do we think others want from this as well? Because I think the other part to good engagement is a chance to build relationships. Certainly we're listening, but it's also a chance for us to be learning as well, which sometimes are two different things. The next step is we get reams and reams and reams of paper or notes. How have we built that in a way that we can then start synthesizing, to your point, around finding some of those key themes? So that intentionality or purposefulness is just so important.
So a good connectivity to the planning process is after you've done your initial kind of draft of vision mission. Most organizations would do an updated environmental scan, trying to understand what's changed and so on. It's from that environmental scan, both external and internal, that some things will pop up in terms of, wow, these seems to be issues we need to pay attention to. So not a laundry list, but maybe 3 to 5. So it's really using that as your guide to say, okay, then we need to hear from the community and stakeholders around these 3 to 5 topics.
It's a bold thing for trustees, and I think it's a great sign of leadership to, before we lock that down and we have that finished, that we've given all this stakeholder input, the reflection time it needs. And if that means we need to come back to our mission, vision, values after thinking about it at the start of the process, then let's do that. And I've had numerous occasions where, around the conversation with leadership, we've had this one idea that's been floating, but it's not for us, not important to us. We go out and do the stakeholder engagement. That idea suddenly percolates right to the top. Right. And that's permission for the board or the trustees to come back and say, oh, well, gosh, okay, we need to be leaning in more on topic A, whatever that is.
So that connectivity follows all the way through. And then it's only after you have determined your set of, strategic priorities or strategic directions, then it leads into, now, do we need to revisit our vision and mission? Otherwise, it's too big a jump.
That's mission critical right there. That is, it's really important that whether you're engaging people face to face, on paper, or on screen, that they really understand what you're going to do with their input, how their voice is going to influence it. And, we could chat quickly about this idea of IAP2, International Association of Public Participation. It's a model that allows you to clearly articulate with your communities or stakeholders their role they're going to play in this conversation. And there's 5 steps to the IAP2 spectrum, and it starts with inform, and it ends in empower.
And I think in general, for any district school board that will be going into any type of a planning process, is really good practice to actually have a communications plan that actually anchor and support the whole planning process throughout, so that whether it's the broader community or only specific communities, that people are kept informed about, where are we? Where are you in the planning process? Here are the groups that, we're engaged in conversation. This is when the trustees will be having the deliberation, and this is when kind of final decisions will be made. So it's managing people's expectations.
We often hear, we held a meeting and no one showed up. Well, probably because the meeting was at a time and a place and on a topic that maybe just wasn't that relevant. So back to our earlier conversation around intentionality, where can we meet people as opposed to asking them to come to us?
Right.
And so regardless if we're doing this in person, on screen, or on paper, which are probably the 3 ways that
in general
that we could do that, but how are we meeting these communities where they're at? How are we going to them? The technology is relative, and there's lots of tools out there with the technology. But the in-person meeting can be a success if it's planned around thinking about your audience and what's most convenient for them.
I would add to that a couple of things. One, for the groups that traditionally have not participated actively, so especially in communities, newcomer communities, because some of them are not even communities yet, and some groups might not have been comfortable in any type of engagement. You have to be extra sensitive about ways that they're comfortable in engaging. So going to them, whether it's at a community center at a convenient time, in many urban rural communities, language is becoming a challenge. Not everyone English is the first language. Not even everyone have comprehension of English. So again, just being understanding about what different communities need in terms of supports, whether it's translation, whether it's in methods that they're more comfortable with. Some people are not comfortable with just vocalizing their personal views in front of a large group. They prefer to write it down, send it in. So again, you have to really plan carefully so that you are getting that kind of engagement, input in a way that those groups are comfortable with. A smartphone is the fastest thing these days for engagement because you don't have to be literate. So we have in some situations where we just give people 3 questions, simple, and you just have to press it on your
Yeah.
phone. You like 1, you like 2, like
Yeah.
3.
Yeah.
So there are ways to cut through literacy, language, accessibility, comfort of engagement that are quite different than even 5 years ago.
Yeah, and I think this draws on an earlier conversation we had around equity and inclusion. Like, this is where the rubber hits the road, to your point, around where are we meeting these communities and spaces that are welcoming to them and languages that are welcoming to them.
Yeah.
And again, I'd offer it's mission critical now. We just can't be doing engagement the way we want to. We have to be doing a way that's inclusive and listening and
Right.
opening, allowing us to hear those voices from the community. 6 months would be a reasonable...
4 to 6.
Yeah, 4 to 6 for sure. Anything
4 to
shorter than that, I
6.
think you're going to put pressure on yourself
Right.
to be missing steps. Anything longer, you lose a sense of urgency. And that's a creative tension in this process. You want to have a sense of urgency. We want to get this done, and we want to be as engaging and having as many conversations along the way. So that, it's, again, from a leadership standpoint, I think it's good for trustees to say, we can't let this stretch over anything beyond the 4 to 6 window, because otherwise it loses some of that enthusiasm people may have for it. I think there's 2 parts to that. There's a strategic lens you put on that, which is the why. Back to Helen's point, I really like that. Why do we want to be engaging these stakeholders, and how is it going to be impacting our day-to-day business, if you will? So you need to have that conversation, and again, it can't just be for the sake of doing so. It needs to be back to some of the measurables and the transparency that we want to have as an organization. Tactically then, you can go back to this on-screen, in-person, on-paper matrix, if you will, and break out your stakeholders that way. It doesn't have to be big and complicated. I really encourage groups not to overthink that. It could be as simple as a quarterly newsletter, or maybe a newsletter every, twice a year.
Right.
Maybe it's some town hall meetings. Let's not forget internal stakeholders, especially in a school board, with as many staff, passionate people as we have.
Administrators.
How are we keeping them engaged? Maybe that's a more regular check-in. Maybe that's monthly.
Right.
Here's our report card. Maybe with the community, that's once a year.
I think for any strategic plan to be relevant, it can't just sit on the shelf for 4 years and then, dust it off again. It has to be actively used to guide decision making. So school board meetings are open, right? So you get minutes of those. So a good practice would be bare bone minimum once a year, have a touch point, taking a look at what are your commitments that you have made as priorities, where are you at the end of year 1, and then based on that, let the broader community know about, wow, we've made terrific progress on this, but we're a little
Still
bit,
working here,
held up by X because of that. So that adds to that accountability and transparency.
It's foundational again in terms of how we're responding to our community, because the strategic plan, we've got a communication plan that goes with that. So we've got relationships, we've got mechanisms, we've got ways to be engaging our community already. So we've already got tools that are allowing us then to focus in and think about whatever we need to be doing around this communication piece, the crisis piece. And I really do think that good crisis communication is built on the work that we've done in the past.
There's an element in strategic planning that we have not talked about, which is risk assessment and risk mitigation, because as you said, in the best of all worlds, there's still things that happen that's not known to you, whether it's good risk or bad risk. And when those risks do happen, then if you do actually have an element of your risk assessment strategy as part of your planning process, then you're not scrambling. So the strategic plan is your anchor, and it's a good place to check back. One, you deal with the crisis of the moment and making sure that you have the right processes and accountabilities to respond. But also, even after you have responded, you still want to do some reflection about how did that happen. And on the stakeholder part, quite often, more and more now, I see organizations having the media as one of the important stakeholder, because the media can also be a great supporter. They're not always there to, just kind of, jump on you when something goes bad. So if you have good relationship with different media over time, they understand where you're going, they understand your business. Crisis communications is really helpful when you have those good relationships and say, hey, we're dealing with it. You understand, and what happened and why and so on. So that kind of relationship is also good to have on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely.